Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and Just Work.
And I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. On the second episode of this season, which by the way is season 4, we discussed the Get Shit Done wheel. And in our last episode, you heard about step 1 of the wheel, which was called listen. Today we're talking about the second step on the GSD wheel, which is clarify. Go ahead, feel free to check out the previous 2 episodes if you want to learn more. But in the meantime, if you've created a culture of listening, the next step in the Get Shit Done wheel is to push yourself and your direct reports to understand and convey thoughts and ideas more clearly. Trying to solve a problem that hasn't been clearly defined is not likely to result in a good solution. According to Kim, debating a half-baked idea is likely to kill it. Kim, you still agree with that?
Yes, I do.
And Kim, we'll have to go into some more detail about when something becomes half-baked, like is quarter-baked enough.
Half-baked is delicious. That's all I can say.
Half-baked is delicious, yes. So we're now doing Radically Candid Recipes with Kim Scott. You know what? I'm just realizing now we had an aggressive word in here.
What?
We said it was debating a half-baked idea is likely to kill it.
Yeah, it's likely to destroy it. I don't know.
That's pretty aggressive. Destroy
That's
and
also,
kill.
that's debating a half-baked idea is likely to ruin its outcome. Discourage it.
Yeah, discourage it. Yeah, I do think that an aggressive word here might be help the point, though. You know, to some degree, like the problem is when we debate too quickly, we actually are sort of trampling a new life form, which is this like a new idea. Like it actually does describe it. Whereas like execute, I feel like is no better. Is not any better than implement. And in fact, could be argued to be worse because it is unnecessarily violent. In this case, violence is kind of the point. We don't want to.
Yeah,
we don't want to violently
don't want to
disrupt.
kill a new idea. Yes.
Yeah.
Jason, thank you for clarifying that.
See, this is why debate.
Yeah, exactly. This is why our quarter-baked idea was delicious, but also elicited some learning. So thank you for that. Well, as we discussed in our overview episode of the Get Shit Done wheel, it is important to push the people on your team to clarify their thinking and ideas, and you don't want to squish. I think that was the verb you used. You don't want to squish their best thinking or ignore problems that are bothering them. And so that's exactly what we were just talking about, is how can we not just understand new ideas clearly, but also what's equally important, often more difficult, understand the people to whom your team is going to have to explain the ideas clearly.
Yes, because in order to explain, for example, in some sort of math thing clearly to a mathematician is going to be very different than explaining it to me, the Slavic literature person.
Yep.
Well said. And it really goes to exactly what we talk about all the time, which is that radical candor is measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the other person's ear or comprehension, which of course is based at how are they processing the information. So the 2 most important things to do when clarifying an idea is first, get clear about it in your own mind. And as a manager, one way you can do this is create a safe space for people to discuss and nurture ideas, to not squish them. And second, to make sure you can explain the idea in a way that's crystal clear to other people, from mathematicians to Slavic literature experts. So, Jason, what is your process for getting clear about an idea in your own mind?
I think this gets into a little bit what makes for good brainstorming conversations, but I'll just talk about how I use this insight for myself. So one of the things that I've realized is that new ideas, the development and refinement of new ideas, is a nonlinear process.
Amen.
It is a nonlinear process. It is very frustrating that it is a nonlinear process. We want it to be.
Jason, I feel like you're speaking from personal experience there.
I am speaking from personal experience. So spending a lot of time nurturing a design team whose goal it was to come up with creative solutions to problems that had never been solved before, I can tell you that the best ideas were often, first of all, they started out as adjacent to other ideas. It wasn't the most obvious solution. It was something next to that thing that inspired us to go down another path. And then we would get partway down that path and we'd be like, no, we kind of had a better idea a few ideas ago. So then we'd like back up the path and we'd pick up the idea that we were playing with a few days ago. And then we'd start down another path. And from my perspective, each time that you do that, you are learning something about what is essential to the idea that you're working with, right? You're like, oh, I really valued. So for example, it's like, when I was putting together a video recently, I was thinking that I was having this sort of question in my mind of like, what is it that I think is most important to the client? So I was trying to help people understand the context of the work that we were doing with a client. What do I think is most important to a client? What do I think it is that people on the team already know or assume? And then I tried one version of the presentation. I got partway down and I was like, no, I don't think this is actually clear enough about what's important to the client. So I sort of like backed it up. And what I wound up doing is I wound up splitting the presentation into two parts. One part where I was like, hey, here's the general client context, and then here's the specific audience context. So the thing that our facilitators would be most exposed to is like the actual audience in front of them. And when I split those two things apart, all of a sudden it became very clear to me. Like it was very obvious that I could explain both of those things separately and make it easier for people. But that was not just about empathy for them. It was also empathy for myself. Because as I was trying to put it together, I was finding it was very confusing and jumbled in my head until I found that point of separation. And so
and Jason, I'm really curious, like, do you think you would have been able to, like, you wouldn't necessarily have been able to make that separation without having first made that confusing, jumbled first pass? Is that accurate?
Exactly. Yes. Oh, well, I'm sure there's someone out there who would have realized that sooner than me. So just to be fair to all the other brilliant people out there, someone would have figured that out faster than I did. And at the same time, I think my biggest learning is like I need to have patience with myself. And when I find that it is frustrating, when I find myself frustrated in trying to articulate the idea, either in writing or to draw it or whatever else, I've learned to recognize that for what it is, which is like, I haven't quite figured out what is essential about this. And I need to give myself some time to back up and re-examine the thing until I find a path that feels easier. And I think that's the experience has led me to understand that feeling of ease is often associated with a path, like a valuable path to follow.
Kim, I'm so curious as Jason is talking, I'm thinking about you as an author of several books, and especially Radical Candor and Just Work, which have made such an impact in the world, and just your process of literally sharing your books with, if I'm not mistaken, hundreds of potential readers at a time, so much that it would crash Google Docs. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, it only took 115 people and 300 pages to crash Google Docs.
But I'm so curious, like from your own process as a writer, and you also say that as a boss, your job is to be the editor. Where do you see clarification, even with your own ideas, how writing helps that and how that influences your process of clarifying ideas for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, as Jason said, there's two parts to it. The second hardest thing about writing, for me anyway, is getting inside my own head. And giving myself the space and the time to have all these arguments with myself, to be radically candid with myself. Like, do I really believe this? There were several things in Radical Candor where I had written many, many, many pages about something before realizing that I thought I was wrong and that I disagreed with it, and that happened often. In fact, with Just Work, I wrote, I think, 80,000 pages and then threw it away and started over. Not because I totally disagreed with myself in that case, but I had the structure wrong. So I think that's the second hardest thing is sort of wrestling with myself. But the very hardest thing about writing, for me anyway, is getting back out of my own head. And that is where I need other people and a lot of other editors. That's why I have so many people I begged so many different people to read early versions. And I'm so grateful for the people who are willing. I describe, it's not just a shitty first draft. It's like vomit on the page. It's really disgusting. But now I'm mixing lots of disgusting metaphors. That half-baked, that's my favorite part of the process, actually. The messy, part, writing is editing. In many ways, what clarifying an idea is about what you're going to take out and what you're going to strip away, or as Jason said, how you're going to divide it into a couple of different phases. So, for example, when I was at Apple, we used to talk about clarifying new ideas, and we would use Picasso's bull. And, his first, there's a lithograph of, 9 or 12 or something, the different sketches. And the first one that he drew was, more detailed than the last one. It's just a few lines. And I think that's a big part of clarifying is, first of all, wrestling in your own head with what you're trying to draw, and then figuring out what is the simplest way to explain it to someone else. And again, adjusting depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, it's really interesting because Jason got to a place where you were talking about ease, and Kim, you're talking about simple. And, I think one of the reasons why people love the Radical Candor framework is there is like this real simple elegance. And yet, if I'm hearing you, it's not like we just, write down a 2x2 with there was a lot of effort to get to the simple elegance of the framework.
Yeah, it took, when I started to write Radical Candor, I thought I could write it in 3 months because I had taught this class, Managing at Apple, and then I had helped Dick Costello create Managing at Twitter, and I thought I knew exactly what I wanted to say, and it was just a matter of getting it down on paper. But 3 months stretched into 4 years, and a lot of different conversations with a lot of different people. In fact, there were several months where I did nothing but experiment with different titles of the 2x2. Like, was it Care Personally? Was it Give a Damn? I forgot all the different ones I had. And then Challenge Directly was Disagree, Say No, like a lot of different things. And then each of the 4 quadrants had many. In fact, for a long time, I was calling the book Cruel Empathy, not. And Jack Dorsey was one of the people I asked to read it, and he refused to read it. He said, I'm not going to read a book called Cruel Empathy. It sounds like a Harlequin romance. So that convinced me to think harder, but that was what helped me clarify that, conversations like that really helped me clarify what I was trying to say. And I'm grateful to all those people who helped.
Well, and I'm grateful as a reader, and I'm also grateful as a writer. It's very heartening to know that the editing process is not a walk in the park. And if anyone wants to learn more about that, Anne Lamott is certainly my favorite.
Yes, mine too. Bird by bird.
Bird by bird, and the quote about, hating writing but loving having written. So to go back to what, Jason, you were talking about with brainstorming sessions, where do you see actual brainstorming sessions fitting into the clarifying process?
As we said at the top of the podcast, when ideas are new, we want to create a space specifically to talk about those ideas in a way that supports their development, as opposed to encourage them to be crushed underfoot as we trample over them. And brainstorming sessions, having a name for it and having an intention behind these conversations where the goal is to actually help the idea get better are super, super valuable, because it's important to remember that the rest of the time, when you're not in a brainstorming session, you're in operating mode. You're in make stuff happen. You're in implement and make stuff happen mode. And that you want to get out of that mindset for a brainstorming session and create an opportunity to actually play with ideas. And so I think of brainstorming as quite playful. And this idea, we reference this idea of plussing. Pixar has this idea of plussing. And in the world of improv, we have yes and. But that is definitely the spirit of a brainstorming session, is to build up, right? To say, yes, I like that. And what if we did this? And what if we did that? And so that's a great opportunity to start to clarify an idea, because when an idea is half-baked, there's lots of good stuff in there, but there's also lots of probably bad / unnecessary stuff. And the only way to learn what the difference is between those things is to actually have people start to play with it and try to find the goodness in it.
And interestingly, the plussing, the yes-anding, to quote Kelly Leonard, can also point out some of the reasons why an idea might be bad. I think we have this tendency to create this yes and is all about positive. So sometimes you can take an idea to its logical extreme by yes anding, and then that's also good. It's a good thing.
I'm afraid to say yes. I'm afraid to say yes and at this point. So sorry, Jason, what were you saying?
Yes and. I think the idea of we're not polishing, right? We're like tacking on. We're like pulling apart and putting back together. We're not refining necessarily. We're sort of like defining. Refining comes later, right? Refining comes like once the idea started to crystallize, and then we can debate it. Like that's the point at which we really start to like figure out where the sharp edges are and to start to cut those off. But I really loved brainstorming sessions, and at the same time, they were sometimes the most frustrating conversations, because if you're not used to brainstorming and you don't accept that ideation and stuff is not linear, which not all members of the team at Khan Academy, for example, accepted. It was very frustrating for them because they wanted to come in and like rubber stamp something. Like that was their idea of a brainstorming session. We're going to come in here, we're going to talk about this idea, and when we leave, we'll have decided which of these things we're going to do and exactly what it's going to look like. And I think that's hard for a lot of people to get out of that, to shift out of that mode. But the yes anding is a technique.
Yeah, I'm so grateful you brought that in, Jason, as an extrovert and a nonlinear thinker. I love a brainstorm, but not everyone loves a good old-fashioned brainstorm. Wharton professor Adam Grant talks about 3 issues of just going ahead and putting a bunch of smart people in a room together. First of all, some folks might be more introverted and end up being ignored, or certainly feeling ignored. Number 2, there's a tendency where people actually hold back from sharing the most outlandish ideas, which could also be the most innovative, that fear of, maybe looking stupid in a group. And then 3rd, what can happen is that groups can experience convergent thinking, where everyone's jumping on the bandwagon and agreeing with an idea and then stifling ideas that might be less popular. And so one suggestion from Adam Grant is that people actually write their thoughts on paper first, asynchronously, and then share in the group, having a really long list. And there's also data to suggest that brainstorming can work best when people are coming up with ideas on their own and then having the time and space to explore them asynchronously. So, Jason, I saw you give a thumbs up on that, but Kim, I'm just curious, where do you think asynchronous brainstorming or asynchronous thinking time before a brainstorm can help?
Well, I think that's why it's important to me to write that half-baked, shitty first draft in private, because I need to be able to turn off my editor, to have no inner boss, but just be the wild child, as I write the first draft. And I think it's also why, and then when I bring other people in, I want to bring the kind of people in who are not going to be, there are certain people I would never invite to read an early first draft because they're going to be so turned off by the messiness of it that I know they won't be able to notice they won't be able to engage in a way that's helpful. And so I think that it's really important, if you're gonna brainstorm, to help people shift out of that desire for linear process, desire for, efficiency. Like if I am in my, what do we call it? Implementing mode, not my execution mode, my implementing mode, I am all about efficiency. But when I shift into brainstorming mode or into writing mode, I got to get out of that, and I got to allow what I thought was going to take 3 months to take 4 years. And, we don't always have the luxury to spend. I mean, I was lucky that I had the luxury to keep going. Part of it is also making it fun. If it's not fun, you're not going to come up with your best ideas. You really have to be free and to innovate. And that's tricky. That can be tricky. When I'm in implementing mode, I'm narrowing my focus, I'm narrowing my attention, I'm demanding efficiency, and I'm not as free.
Yeah, Jason, I'm wondering, as Kim is sharing that, in the meetings where you're going to be the one implementing and someone's coming up with all these ideas and you're telling them in your head of how many months it's going to take or 4 years, I'm feeling some people listening to this and starting to feel stressed at the very thought of, oh gosh, so I'm going to be in this meeting and someone's just going to, be spitballing these ideas and it'll, and I'm going to be the one left holding the bag to implement it. So how have you addressed that potential inhibition to fun and play for the folks that are in the room that are the ones going to have to actually carry it out?
It's all about rules, which seems weird, but it is. Like, from my perspective, you want to make this a game. Like, to Kim's point about making it fun, you want to make brainstorming or refining of ideas fun for people. And in order to do that, because it is not natural for everyone to get out of these modes, you do have to make rules. So this idea of, no butting, right? Like, you can't butt that idea. You can build on it, but you can't tear it down. And it seems like, well, isn't that actually a constraint? And wouldn't that lead to but it is. And it has a sort of magical power of forcing people to think about how do I build on this? How do I take this further, as opposed to how do I sort of refine, edit, chop it down? The other thing is no decision. That's probably the biggest piece of context is we're not making a decision at the end of this meeting. That is not the goal of this meeting, is for all of us to agree on something. The goal of this meeting is for Jason, maybe I'm pitching the idea, for me to have a lot of new input, exciting and interesting ideas for me to go follow up on after this conversation. I want to be inspired to go try and think and do things differently because of the conversation that we're having. That's really what's going to help me make this idea as good as possible. And I used to have other rules as well, but enforcing those rules, which is we build, we don't tear down, rule number one, and we don't make decisions. We're not getting to an answer, made a huge difference in people's willingness to actually engage. And the rules are comforting, especially to those other folks who might be feeling I need to be in implement mode, because we're no, you're not in implement mode. In fact, you're doing a great service to the group by behaving exactly the opposite of what you would instinctually do. And we're going to reward that richly by being grateful to one another, by egging people on, by continuing to build or contribute.
And I think the other important rule is that the brainstorm can't go on forever. Really? I was willing to give writing Radical Candor 4 years, but not 8 years. At a certain point, as they said at Apple, real artists ship. You got to finish.
I love that.
She said ship.
Yes, ship.
Yep.
Yes.
Ship it.
Ship it. And that's one of your favorite phrases, and that certainly inspires me. So, Jason, I'm curious. So we've talked about brainstorming sessions. One of the things that Kim talks a lot about in the book are the importance of weekly one-on-one meetings as a way to clarify folks' thinking. And so, Jason, where do you see one-on-one meetings being a part of the clarification process?
Well, to some extent, I want to turn the question back around on you, since I feel it's my job in our one-on-one meetings to help you clarify your thinking. But I'll say this, which is one thing that I'm very conscious of when as a manager holding one-on-one meetings with people who work for me, is that it's very easy for me to accidentally shut down an idea. Without really intending to, it's very easy for me to say something or do something that makes it seem like I am not excited or interested in, and people are looking so carefully for those cues that I have to be very conscious when I go into these meetings of hey, I'm going to go into supporting ideation. I'm going to go into refining ideas mode. And so when I do that, there are two things that I do. Again, I build on ideas. I say, what if, a yes and I ask lots of questions, tell me more about that. How do you think about that? What happens if we do this? Those kinds of things. So I switch very much into a building curiosity mode. Anyway, that's my goal. But I'm kind of curious, does that come across in our one-on-one meetings, or am I failing?
I have no idea what you're talking about. No, I was actually, before you started talking, I was actually going to go right to questions and the importance of powerful questions and open questions. And, one thing I really appreciate, and I know I've talked about this before on the podcast, but how much of a thought partner you are. And I'm very aware that your style is much more autonomous and working on your own. And I'm much more of a collaborative thought partner. And I get ideas by these kinds of conversations. And I certainly get more clarity by talking with you. And so I really appreciate, first of all, that you're going probably outside of your natural style. Is that accurate? Would you say that your style is more to work on your own?
I don't know if you've ever done the colors personality profile thing. It was fairly big at Google for a while. I think it's still used in lots of places, but I am modal in the same way that Kim is. So I'm like a blue, green, like a switch between these two things. And blue is like pie in the sky, big idea, bright, like big, bright blue, like anything's possible. And then green is like, you get things done through your team. That was like, those are the two sort of like modes that the colors are meant to describe. And I guess I recognize that like I'm comfortable in either of them as long as I'm clear in my head which one I'm in. If I'm not clear in my head which one I'm in, then I am very uncomfortable, and I am often like, not only am I maybe not as helpful as I could be, but I'm also cranky about it because I feel like we should be doing stuff, but you know what I'm saying? Like it's actually important for me to be clear in my own mind.
Well, first of all, that's very helpful for me because I never experienced that on my side. So that's just more data. But one of the things that I think I value most about you is your ability to ask thoughtful questions that help me get more clarity from my own thinking. And this is something that we see a lot in our listening exercise where it's like, well, if you can just be in that discomfort of the silence, the person will figure it out themselves. And so I think you have that ability not just to ask the great question, but actually to pause and give space for me to come to a conclusion or an inference that I certainly wouldn't have had, not just the question, but actually the space for me to process it and really get to what you're asking. And then if I'm actually not quite clear on what you're asking, I found we actually end up having even more interesting conversations when we're maybe going off onto some of these side topics. So I find you what Kim defines as a thought partner, like the consummate thought partner for me, which is really about asking questions, helping me clarify in my own head.
Glad it's working for somebody.
5 stars. It's working for somebody. Kim, just to put the shoe on your foot, if that's even a helpful metaphor, do you have an example, since today is like all about how Jason is a great thought partner, when you and Jason were talking about new ideas that help clarify your thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And this happened in a one-on-one meeting. And again, I think the mindset of a one-on-one meeting is the same thing as a mindset for a first draft or for a get-to-know-you conversation or for a brainstorm conversation. You want to go into these meetings open to like talk about. So I didn't have in mind in this one-on-one that Jason and I were going to talk about the sort of go-to question. I wasn't going to ask him for feedback on how I'm asking for feedback, but he had said something, he had written something in a slide about different kinds of go-to questions one could use. And my favorite question was not included on Jason's slide. And so I asked him about it. And that was when he told me that
Can I just actually ask, how specifically did you ask that question? Do you remember what words you said? Like, were you feeling any frustration that your favorite question wasn't there? Was there any emotion around that?
No, I just wondered why wasn't there. I mean, I just was, I think, curious.
So you were, okay, great.
I didn't have I mean, this is kind of embarrassing. It never occurred to me that he didn't like it.
Why is that embarrassing? I feel like
I don't know.
the most interesting things in life happen right after you're like, why would anybody possibly think differently than this?
Yeah, it had not occurred to me that you didn't like it. I just was wondering, like, why did you change? Why did you change that slide? And I hadn't intended to ask it. It just kind of came up. And I think that's one of the nice things about conversations and conversations with people. This was relatively early on as we were getting to know each other, starting to work together. And I think that that's one of the nice things about these get to know you conversations is you go into, in fact, one of the things I used to ask my direct reports when I was working at Google to do is one-on-one per quarter. I asked them to come in without an agenda. and we'd just talk. And we didn't know what we were going to talk about. And all kinds of different things. We would often just have a nice conversation and get to know each other a little bit better. Or we would talk about, some work-related thing that wouldn't have come up otherwise. And so I think it's really important for those one-on-one conversations to be kind of like those intense, for some reason this keeps coming to mind, so I'm just going to say it. When I was in college, I remember at one point I was having dinner with two of my really good friends who are still talk to all the time. Actually, not all the time. I don't talk to them, either one, often enough. But anyway, two really good friends. And I remember we were just kind of wound up talking about the future and what we wanted. And it was such a meaningful conversation. And I remember my one friend, Ellen, was drawing little pictures of houses as we were talking, because we were sort of talking about what kind of life we wanted. Every once in a while, I think we can all imagine we have these conversations that really have a lot of meaning for us in our relationships and just in our life. The whole point to me of life is communication with people. If you can have those kinds of conversations at work, that's the answer to Marx's alienation from labor, not Marxism.
Yeah. I like that, Kim. And I think that there's a theme coming out of this for me, which is something that comes up often in conversations about radical candor, which is you're talking about one conversation a quarter. This doesn't have to be 7 hours a week where you're doing this. You can time boxing nonlinear stuff is a really helpful way to create serendipity, right? To find something that you didn't expect to find, but you don't have to infinitely feed nonlinear. You can switch between these things. You can say, we're going to have a moment to be without an agenda, for us to just talk to one another. And I think that is a consistent drumbeat for me in the guidance that we give, which is yes, invest in the relationship, care about the person. That doesn't mean you have to spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week only doing that. There's other stuff that you can do, but you want to make sure that you're being intentional about the time you do spend creating space for these other things, which might not otherwise happen naturally.
It's interesting. We do this at dinner. Andy said to me, because he noticed that I tended to bring to the dinner table, and dinner lasts, if we're lucky, 15 minutes. It's a very short thing with the kids at this point. They're not interested, but we're very strict about spending at least 15 minutes at dinner. My husband, Andy, noticed that I tended to bring complaints. I tended to bring some feedback to the dinner table. And he said, this is not your feedback time, Kim. This is not your time to criticize the kids. This is your time to talk. And that has really helped us have an open, keep dinner table conversation open, not too focused on having an agenda.
And it actually goes with what Jason was saying of sort of rules and guidelines of and actually then the freedom from the structure. Kim, I would be remiss if I didn't get back to the clarification that Jason provided on the surprising go-to question that he was not fond of from that slide.
My question was, what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? And Jason, you can say what you said to me.
All I said was, that's a hard question for me to answer. It's just too big, too open-ended. Is there something more specific that you want to know? And Kim obliged. She asked me what's something I did in the last week that made it difficult to work with me. That's a much clearer, easier question for me to answer, and I appreciated it.
And what's great about that exchange is that happens a lot with our go-to questions, where it's oh, this question doesn't actually work for me, or it is too broad. So we're doing the things we're teaching as well. Well, that's all for this episode, folks. We've got so much to say about clarifying. We've split it into 2 episodes. You can catch part 2 of Clarify in 2 weeks. It's time for our Radical Candor checklist, and these are tips you can use to start putting radical candor into practice.
Tip number 1, use your one-on-one meetings to help people clarify their ideas. You create a safe and open space where people can come in and just talk to you about stuff. They don't have to have proposals. They don't have to have solutions. They just can come and talk. This is the part of Radical Candor where you put your phone in your pocket and you talk to people. Maybe you're taking a walk with them. Maybe you're talking on the phone. Maybe you're lucky enough to be in person. Maybe you're lucky enough to be talking on the phone and taking a walk, whatever it is. That's what Jason and I are going to do as soon as we finish this podcast. We're going to take a virtual walk together.
Oh, I love that. Tip number 2, as the boss, you're the editor and not the writer. Help your team members clarify their own ideas before presented to others by helping them choose what to eliminate and what to emphasize based on the audience that will be hearing the idea.
Tip number 3, encourage people to brainstorm and explore ideas asynchronously before they bring them to the larger group. When they are going to brainstorm, make sure that there are clear rules in place so that people can fully participate in that session in a way that is helpful. And remember, no brainstorm goes on forever.
For more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources. Go ahead, download our learning guides for practicing Radical Candor. We'll have a bunch of show notes for you. Go to radicalcandor.com/podcast. Go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Don't forget, I always like to hear Kim share the title of her latest book.
It is Just Work: How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Create a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity.
And again, the Radical Candor store is now open. Go to radicalcandor.com, click the shop link. You can always reach out to us at podcast@radicalcandor.com. Bye for now. Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.